Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. My name's Anita Marks. Today I'll be presenting some of my research from my PhD through the School of Environment Science and Engineering here at SCU. My supervisors Ross Goldingay and David Newell. So the topic of my talk today is on long-term trends of squirrel glider populations in urban habitats, investigating causes of decline. So just broadly, my PhD falls within threatened species research, and I'm particularly investigating how threatened species are able to persist in urban habitats. So we'd be pretty familiar with the fact that Australia has a lot of land clearing. Associated with land clearing is the fragmentation of habitats, fragmentations of populations, increasing threatened species, etc. So as we're seeing an increase in fauna that are exposed to human disturbances, we need to establish ways that we're able to conserve these species and allow their persistence. And there are many threatened species that do occur in urban habitats within Australia, so it's really important that we understand how they respond to disturbance, what sort of factors lead to decline, and then in many ways be able to improve persistence and employ strategies that we can help to mitigate the declines. So the purpose and aims of my little bit of study that I'm showing you today is to investigate the small population of squirrel gliders in Brisbane. This population has been studied for many years, and so my study really is to add to the existing knowledge of the population. So squirrel gliders are a small gliding mammal. They're related to possums. Most people are familiar with the sugar glider, which is a close cousin of the squirrel glider. They occupy the same ecological niche, but are slightly different morphologically. So I'm really wanting to understand the causes of decline in this population particularly, but hopefully the results of my study will be able to help develop strategy to assist persistence, which can be replicated across many other populations and other species within Australia. So I'm looking at 4 main causes of decline in this study, and these are listed here. We've got habitat quality and environmental conditions. So for the squirrel glider, this would be like the availability of resources, hollow trees, flowering eucalypts, this sort of thing. And then broadly, things like rainfall and environmental conditions, how do these affect the persistence of a population? I'm also looking at introduced predators, so red foxes and cats particularly. Red foxes and cats are present all throughout Australia, and they have a huge detrimental impact on native fauna, including arboreal fauna, believe it or not. So I'm seeing if there's any predation from introduced species. I'm also looking at a biological component. So I'm specifically looking at the production of cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and seeing if cortisol production is affecting the fitness of the gliders. So obviously, if an animal is producing higher levels of cortisol to what's normal, then this does reduce fitness and can lead to declines in the long term. And finally, I'm also looking at genetic conditions, so seeing if there's evidence of inbreeding within the population and establish ways that we can manage this if there is. I've just got a picture here of a well-known inbreeding study which was looking at mountain lions in the US and the expression of a tail kink within an inbred population. They were able to reintroduce genetic variation into this population to assist the persistence. So the methods, I've been conducting field work for about 2 years now, and that involves trapping the squirrel gliders using Elliott traps, these metal boxes. We collect the glider, we measure body condition, we take the weight, etc. We collect tissue samples and hair samples for some other analyses. And then all this data is called mark recapture data, and we can use that to understand the demographics of the population. So we input that data into a software program which can help us understand the size estimates of the population. We can also look at survival estimates, number of other estimates which I won't go into detail, but this is really a helpful way of just understanding the baseline condition of the population. And then the other areas of investigation which I mentioned earlier, the genetics, stress hormones, habitat and predators as well. So this is the first little bit of data which I'm showing, and this is the population trend of the squirrel gliders over time. So this is from one population called the Minipi population, located in Brisbane. And this population has been the subject of study since 2004. So we have a really well-developed data set which runs over 16 years, which we were able to utilize in this study. So you can see there's been a gap in sampling between 2009 and 2014. But something that we've clearly noticed is that from about 2007, 2008, there's been a quite marked decline compared with 2015 population estimates and really in the years following. So something has happened to this population and we're not really sure what, which is why we're investigating it, which has led to the population to decline and then to seemingly not recover to the size that it has been previously. So you'll see that like in the 5 years since trapping resumed in 2015, the estimates of the population are yet to reach sort of the highs of those recorded between 2004 and 2007. So this suggests that either there's something within the population that's constraining it, maybe a demographic factor or genetics which are preventing the population to recover, or perhaps there's an external factor which is putting a constraint on the population so they can't recover to the previous numbers as before. So perhaps the carrying capacity within this site has changed, and so fewer animals can actually live here at any one time. So this is what we're wanting to understand and investigate further. So I'll just quickly touch on some of the other parameters which we investigate. I won't really go into too much detail for the sake of time, but with the population modelling, we're able to understand survival estimates. So, for example, survival estimates, there's generally differences between survival of males versus females and different age classes, and this has to do with the structure of the squirrel glider species. So gliders are polygynous breeders, so that means one male mates with multiple females, and so the survival between males is often lower compared with female, as in the survival estimate, and that's because the males are always competing for mates and competing for resources and stuff. So survival from year to year is generally lower than females. This can, of course, vary. We also can look at capture probability, which just has to do with the assumption that when we do trapping, there'll always be some gliders which we can't capture for whatever reason. So this sort of influences the final population estimates that we generate. So now I'm just wanting to focus particularly in the last 2 years, so 2019, 2020. Obviously there's a lot of data which I've collected on this population, so I can only present a little bit to you today, but I was looking at breeding today. So I've just got circled here, this is a percentage of females that were breeding in 2019 and 2020. Now we recall in 2019 it was quite a dry year, and because it was a dry year, there was also quite low flowering observed across the site. So the gliders at Minipi, they rely heavily on the eucalypt flowering as a food source. And also breeding generally occurs, when conditions are ideal, generally occurs within the autumn, winter, spring sort of months. And this is the same time when eucalypts are in flower, particularly in winter. And so I've got this graph here which is showing the number of pouch young plotted against the approximate number of flowers that were recorded across the site. So just think of that as flowering intensity. The flowers are represented by the red line. the pouch young are represented by the bars. So we can see there's like a little bit of breeding occurring. There were some pouch young produced in 2019, but generally flowering was quite low. Then we look at 2020, after a nice wet summer, a lot of flowering occurred during the winter period, and likewise breeding went up a lot. So between 2019 and 2020, the percentage of females breeding increased quite markedly. So in 2019, only about 40% of females were breeding. In 2020, that was up to 94%. So of the animals that I caught, 94% were breeding. So this suggests that there's probably a relationship between, obviously I haven't analysed this statistically yet, this is more just like a descriptive graph, but it shows that potentially there's a relationship between, well, breeding conditions and the success of breeding, and of course we do know that. So now looking, this is rainfall over the years and also the percentage of females breeding from 2015 to 2020. You can see there's quite a nice relationship between the rainfall and also the percentage of females breeding. Again, I haven't analysed this statistically, it's more just descriptive. So this would suggest that if conditions aren't ideal, breeding goes down. And so we could imagine that if there's multiple years of poor conditions, breeding could be low over multiple years. And so individuals getting replenished into the population, individuals that are born are fewer and fewer each year. So then we're relying on the persistence of the adults to keep the population alive. So if there were multiple years of poor conditions and then adults started dying, it is quite likely that we would see a decline in the size of the population. So this is something that I'm currently investigating. Obviously I have a little bit more work to do yet, but it's the current thought that I'm running with. Now I just wanted to show you as well, before I finish up, just some preliminary results from the stress hormones, which I've just recently received back. So we were able to collect cortisol from hair samples from individuals, and these were collected in 2019 and 2020. So we're able to compare between individuals within a population and then also compare cortisol levels between populations themselves. So something I noticed was that the males in 2019 were more stressed than females for whatever reason. But in 2020, the females were then much more stressed than the males. So we can look at a graph here. Graph 1 just demonstrates this increase in stress hormone levels in 2020 with the females. And this is probably to do with breeding. So the higher number of females breeding, obviously breeding is quite a stressful physiological process. So that's quite understandable. We can also compare between populations. So graph 3 and 4 is comparing the females at one site with the females at another site. And so the second site is called Mount Petrie, which I've only just introduced now, just to confuse you all. But this is demonstrating that in 2020, the females at these two different populations had equal or similar stress hormone levels. Quite interesting. Now, my second site, Mount Petrie, which I've been looking at and I'm just referring to now, had a very interesting female. In both 2019 and 2020, this particular female was recorded 6 to 7 times higher cortisol levels than the average female, which is very high. We actually thought it was a abnormality in the data, but it's actually probably right because it happened over 2 years. And the thing I noticed with this glider is that she was also very old. So maybe the older the gliders get, the more stress they get. Who knows? But this is another area of investigation which I'm currently pursuing. And I look forward to finding more out. So that wraps up my talk for today. I hope you found it informative. Feel free to ask me any questions. Thank you.